So we're pleased to welcome this evening Professor Albert Churella to Mass Bay RRE with his program, Penn Central's Albatross, How the New Haven Derailed the Nation's Largest Rail Merger. Albert Churella is a professor of history at Kennesaw State University in Georgia with a specialization in transportation history and regulatory policy. His first book, From Steam to Diesel, examined the technology and managerial practices associated with a complete displacement of existing firms in the railway locomotive industry. He has recently completed a 20-year project to write the complete history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, at one time one of the world's largest business corporations. Volume 1, Building an Empire, 1846 to 1917, was published in 2014. Volume 2, The Age of Limits, 1917 to 1933, was published in October 2023. And the third and final volume, The Long Decline, 1933 to 1968, was published in the fall of 2024. Professor Churella is the president of the Lexicon Group, an educational organization that seeks to promote a dialogue on transportation history and practice. He also holds the distinction of being a National Model Railroad Association Master Rail Model Railroader with a basement-sized layout depicting the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad in 1919. So, Albert, welcome to Mass Bay RRE.
Well, thank you, Dave. Thank you so much for hosting my talk and everything. Thanks to Tom Chase as well. And thanks to everybody in the audience for tuning in this evening. If you're seeing me on screen, I must apologize for the lack of light because I'm giving this talk from a hotel room in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm up here doing some research for my next book on Conrail at the Ford Presidential Library. And I have to say, on a personal note, as someone who got his PhD from The Ohio State University, spending a week in Ann Arbor makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it's a nice town and a great library, and I'm making the best of it. So I'm glad that thanks to the wonders of modern technology, I can talk to all of you here this evening. I feel a little bit self-conscious about talking to you all this evening. I've already been warned by Scott Hartley, who I imagine is in the audience this evening, that there are a lot of people in the audience who know an awful lot about the New Haven, probably more than I do in many cases. My interest has always been in the Pennsylvania Railroad, but of course, those two companies have been very much connected to one another over many years. And my interest is not really the history of the New Haven as a company in its own right, but how the New Haven in many ways did drag down the Penn Central and was not the only reason, but certainly was one of many reasons that contributed to Penn Central's bankruptcy just a couple of years after the company was established. So let's go back way, way before the Penn Central merger and to talk about the New Haven. This shows the company at essentially its greatest extent at a time when it essentially monopolized rail transportation, indeed transportation in general in New England. But if we go back a little farther to the early 1800s, the New Haven route that we know today didn't exist. Instead, people who wanted to get between New York City and Boston were able to rely on a new railroad, the Long Island Railroad, which of course was even more closely connected to the Pennsylvania Railroad in later years, that, as you can see from the map, built down the center of Long Island, well away from the settlements on the coasts. And that was to provide a direct link to Greenport, where people could then board steamships to go across to the mainland and then continue by rail ultimately to Boston. And for the privilege of making that journey on the Long Island Railroad from Brooklyn to Greenport, in 1844, you would have paid a whopping $2.25, which sounds like a bargain given that the fare today is about $31.75, quite a bit more. But if you adjust for inflation, That was the equivalent in 1844 of shelling out nearly $100 to ride to the eastern end of Long Island before you even paid for your steamship fare. And with the Long Island in place, the Long Island Railroad had a temporary alliance, one born of expedience, with two other companies, the New York, Providence, and Boston Railroad, established in 1833, and by 1835, it completed its link between New London and Providence, and also established in 1833 the Hartford and New Haven, which took 11 years to build from New Haven to Springfield, and that ultimately provided for a connection to Boston by rail. And the reason why all of this roundabout construction was necessary was because civil engineers assumed that the coastline of southern Connecticut along Long Island Sound was simply too rough, too cut up with bays and inlets, too rugged to enable railroad construction. Keeping in mind that we're talking about the limited capabilities of railroad locomotives in the 1830s and 1840s. Well, it didn't take long for civil engineering technology to catch up with the realities of the geography of southern Connecticut, and it turned out it was possible to build a rail line along the Connecticut shore. This is Nichols Bridge near Greenwich. This is roughly the same place today. You see it's changed just a little bit in the intervening 175 or so years. And it was that situation that transformed the Long Island Railroad and the other companies on the mainland from allies into competitors, particularly with the construction of the New York and New Haven Railroad, founded in 1844. And by 1848, it had completed a line between New York and Boston via Springfield. And then 11 years later, the shoreline, called that for obvious reasons, provided a much more direct route between New York and Boston, almost immediately plunging the Long Island Railroad into bankruptcy. And it took a while for that company to reorient itself to become what it essentially is today, a railroad that hauls commuters to and from New York City. And the railroads that formed this route very quickly began to consolidate their operations and their finances and establish what amounted to a railroad monopoly over New England. In 1872, a merger created the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad Company. In 1893, that company leased the Old Colony Railroad and formed an alliance with the Boston and Maine to extend their catchment basin even farther to the north. In 1896, the New Haven acquired the Boston Terminal Company. But it wasn't just that. It was also a much broader attempt to create a transportation monopoly, including the use of steamboat lines on Long Island Sound, and an effort to combat the growing threat of local trolleys and longer range interurbans. Beginning in 1895, when the New Haven acquired control of the Stamford Street Railroad, which began as a horse car line. But if you think about what is happening in railroad technology in the late 1800s, electrification is now making it possible to build streetcar and interurban lines, typically using low voltage direct current. And that is causing many of these smaller horse car companies to consolidate. They're looking for capital investment in order to string overhead wire, poles, build generating stations. And the New Haven is happy to provide that in exchange for a measure of control. And this is ultimately what the Stamford Street Railroad looks like once it does electrify. So by 1906, the New Haven controls almost all, 1,500 out of 1,652 miles of trolley and interurban line in Rhode Island, and all but 100 miles of trolley and interurban line in Connecticut. And much of that growth and much of that monopolization occurred thanks to two closely allied people, the financier J.P. Morgan and his railroad operating man, Charles S. Mellon, who represented Morgan's interest in the Northern Pacific before coming to the New Haven. And between 1903 and Morgan's death in 1913, the two of them created a formidable transportation empire in New England. And the photo of Morgan on the left is often referred to as the knife photo, so called because it looks like he's holding a dagger in his left hand. He's not. That's in fact the reflection off the curved armrest of his chair. But the fact that people just assumed that Morgan might be holding a knife indicates what many Americans thought of his ruthless and some would say highly unscrupulous business tactics. And it didn't help, of course, that Morgan's personal yacht was named the Corsair, again, an indication of his business tactics. And Morgan and Mellon together were very busy over a 10-year or so period. In 1904, they gained control of the Central New England Railway. The same year, control of the New York, Ontario, and Western. 3 years later, they obtained a controlling interest in the Boston and Maine and arranged joint operations with the Boston and Albany, which of course was a New York Central subsidiary. In 1906, they moved into suburban transportation with the New York, Westchester, and Boston, a superbly engineered commuter rail line that failed to attract sufficient passengers, largely because it terminated in the Bronx rather than going to Manhattan, which is where most people wanted to get to. And they embraced technological innovation, of course, in the form of electrification. In April of 1905, the New Haven announced that it would begin using electrification, not the more traditional direct current, but rather high voltage alternating current. A much riskier proposition because it was a largely untested technology, plenty of teething problems. But by April of 1907, the New Haven was running the first electric test trains as far as New Rochelle. A couple months later, it began electrified revenue service. And the Pennsylvania Railroad was paying very close attention to what the New Haven was doing with its electrification. Because, of course, the Pennsylvania Railroad had already embarked on the New York improvements. This ambitious $140 million ultimately slate of improvements. The most visible part of that was probably Penn Station in Lower Manhattan, in Midtown Manhattan, but it also included tunnels under the North River, the East River, and a whole bunch of other components as well. Now, obviously, it would not be possible to operate steam locomotives through the Hudson or North River tunnels and through the East River tunnels. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to adopt some form of electrification, but it wasn't clear precisely what form of electrification they would use. George Gibbs, the consulting electrical engineer on the project, considered emulating the New Haven's high voltage alternating current, decided that the technology was still unproven, and concluded that lower voltage direct current transmitted through a third rail rather than through catenary was the preferred method, at least for the near term, though of course within a decade the Pennsylvania Railroad began moving toward high voltage alternating current electrification. And as part of the New York improvements, the Pennsylvania Railroad became very closely allied with the New Haven, thanks to the two companies' joint ownership of the New York Connecting Railroad, which provided a direct rail link between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New Haven through the borough of Queens and ultimately over the Hell Gate Bridge. And as part of that relationship, the PRR established what was often at the time called a community of interest. The New York Connecting Railroad was chartered in 1892, but its importance became much greater in May of 1900 when the Pennsylvania Railroad bought the Long Island Railroad. And 4 years after that, Charles Mellon at the New Haven invited Pennsylvania Railroad President Alexander Cassatt to invest in the New Haven to solidify their relationship. And the Pennsylvania Railroad acquired 10,000 shares of New Haven stock. Not enough, certainly, for the Pennsylvania Railroad to control the New Haven, but it did enable Cassatt to be elected as a New Haven director, and his successors in the Pennsylvania Railroad presidency continued that tradition, ensuring close cooperation between the two companies. In 1910, the Pennsylvania Railroad acquired 50,000 more shares of New Haven stock. James McCrae was at that point serving as the Pennsylvania Railroad's president and a New Haven director. In 1912, Samuel Ray replaced McCrae as a New Haven director. Ray, of course, and president of the Pennsylvania Railroad himself. In 1914, the Pennsylvania Railroad acquired another 25,000 shares of New Haven stock. Again, not enough to guarantee control, but clearly binding these two companies together in a community of interest. And 3 years later, Gustav Lilienthal's Hellgate Bridge opens, and for the first time, trains could pass directly between Washington, Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, although a substantial portion of freight traffic still was carried by watercraft, by lighterage along the East River to its interchange with the New Haven. And so with the completion of the New York improvements, the New Haven controlled a very robust railroad empire in New England, but it was one that very quickly became extraordinarily vulnerable, in part because the great success of J.P. Morgan and Charles Mellon attracted a lot of political opposition, a lot of scrutiny from journalists, and made them and the New Haven quite a few enemies. And remember that this is the progressive era, that period of political, economic, social reform when public opinion turns very much against monopolies, trusts, and against big business and business executives in general. And certainly Theodore Roosevelt, as president, exemplified the progressive era distaste for large corporations and for individuals like Charles Mellon, who's being made to dance the square deal dance. The square deal is Theodore Roosevelt's economic and social agenda, much like, of course, his distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, though not nearly so comprehensive. In May of 1908, the Massachusetts Supreme Court very much followed in this progressive era tradition and voided the New Haven's acquisition of the Boston and Maine. The same month, the first federal antitrust suit against the New Haven is filed. In 1911, the New York Central sells the Rutland Railroad to the New Haven, exacerbating concerns that New Haven is monopolizing transportation. And the same is true in 1912 when the New Haven signs what amounts to a non-interference agreement with the Grand Trunk of Canada, promising not to compete in each other's territories. And the New Haven begins then to give in, particularly after Morgan's death in 1913. And in 1914, the New Haven begins to settle its antitrust cases. But the damage has already been done. The New Haven and its executives have become political pariahs. Um, you never want to read in the newspaper words like indicted and charged and immunity and warrants and bail, but those are words that are increasingly being applied to New Haven executives. What is perhaps even worse in the long run is that the New Haven has become badly overextended financially, thanks to the rapid and quite possibly reckless expansion program. So that in 1903, when Morgan and Mellon began their involvement with the New Haven, the company's debt was 14 million. A decade later, the year of Morgan's death, it had ballooned to $242 million, meaning a lot of fixed charges that the New Haven has to pay just to service that debt. During World War I, traffic levels increased, of course, but the company was largely kept afloat by the United States Railroad Administration, which did not own, but it did manage the nation's railroads between 1918 and 1920. And the payments from the federal government to the New Haven essentially put a Band-Aid over some of the deeper, more systemic problems that the company was facing. But that ended in 1920 when the Esch-Cummings, or Transportation Act of 1920, returned the railroads to private management. Now, the Transportation Act of 1920 did a number of things. And one of the things it did was it embodied a realization that many railroads were not performing well. One example might be the Erie. But the New Haven was also in that group of financially troubled or weak railroads. At the same time, there were a number of strong railroads, like the Pennsylvania Railroad, like the New York Central. And one of the underlying concerns of Congress when it drafted the Transportation Act of 1920 was to provide some balance between the stronger railroads and the weaker railroads to ensure that the strong railroads didn't drive the weak ones out of business. And to do that, Congress called on the Interstate Commerce Commission to group the nation's railroads into a number of self-sustaining systems. Didn't say how many systems, didn't say how that was to be accomplished, and did not give the ICC the authority to force railroads to consolidate. So it's really an impossible task for the Interstate Commerce Commission, but they did their best to comply with the congressional mandate in the Transportation Act of 1920. And they employed an economist from Harvard University, William Z. Ripley, who was probably the nation's foremost transportation expert at the time, to come up with a consolidation plan. And Ripley, perhaps because he's from Boston, or perhaps because he really liked a challenge, decided to start with New England, to figure out how to make the New England carriers part of a self-sustaining, prosperous regional system. And he tried and he tried and he tried and he threw up his hands in despair and he said, essentially, the situation is hopeless. There is no way that the New England carriers, I don't care how you put them together, are going to be really profitable. The route structure is too dense. There's already problems with highway competition, short hauls, high terminal costs, high taxes, all these problems, and there's really no way around them. The only thing that might save them in the long run, Ripley concluded, was to pair them with more profitable railroads outside of the New England region. And he approaches the Baltimore and Ohio, which is nowhere near as strong of a company as the New York Central or Pennsylvania Railroad. But he figures that the Baltimore and Ohio will be interested because they don't reach New England at all. The Pennsylvania Railroad does because of its relationship with the New Haven. The New York Central does, of course, because of its control of the Boston and Albany. but the Baltimore and Ohio just barely reaches greater New York. William Ripley talks to Daniel Willard at the Baltimore and Ohio about this, and Willard says, "Are you kidding me? There is no way we are going to get involved in a sinkhole like New England. There's no way we're going to take on the New Haven. As long as we can interchange traffic with them, that's fine. But their problems are not going to become our problems, particularly since the New Haven has $27.5 million worth of debt set to mature in the year 1922 alone. And nobody at the New Haven was quite certain how they were going to fund that debt. Even though Daniel Willard at the Baltimore and Ohio was not at all interested in the New Haven, the Pennsylvania Railroad was. Now, W.W. Atterbury, who was in the early 1920s the vice president in charge of operations at the PRR, was also the person who was the master manipulator, not just on the Pennsylvania Railroad, but in the nation as a whole. He saw himself as the elder statesman, the natural leader of the entire railroad industry, and he was therefore determined to control the process of consolidation and of grouping these railroads into self-sustaining, profitable systems, though obviously his first interest was to protect the Pennsylvania Railroad. And to do that, he began to buy up securities in any number of railroads. The Lehigh Valley, the Wabash, the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, the list goes on, and the New Haven, because he wanted to ensure that New Haven would continue to originate and terminate traffic delivered to the Pennsylvania Railroad and not come under the control of a hostile trunk line like the New York Central. And his decision is made a little bit easier because in the 1920s, the New Haven enjoys a last burst of prosperity, particularly in the second half of the decade. And after Atterbury becomes the Pennsylvania Railroad's president in 1925, he goes on a buying spree, not only with the Pennsylvania Railroad directly and with the PRR subsidiary, the Pennsylvania Company, but also with Penn Road, which is not a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's an affiliate, not directly connected, but it is certainly a investment affiliate that is acting at the behest of Atterbury and other Pennsylvania Railroad executives. So between them, by late 1929, the Pennsylvania Railroad and Penn Road together own more than 13% of the New Haven. Not enough to ensure control, but enough to ensure that Atterbury is going to have a strong say in the ultimate disposition of the New Haven should there be a system plan for New England. Well, the timing is of course atrocious because late 1929 is the stock market crash, and the New Haven suffers more than most railroads. It is a company that in the 1930s looks good with streamlined locomotives like the I-5, which never could fully perform to their potential because the New Haven's route along the Connecticut shore was too curvaceous. It wasn't straight enough to allow truly fast running. With rail buses like this Michelin effort that never really worked very well in an effort to cut costs. And none of that could stop the downward spiral. By October 1935, the New Haven was bankrupt, and it took 12 years to complete the reorganization of the company. And I'm sure many of you have seen this famous wartime advertisement urging Americans to be patient, with the inevitable disruptions and congestion associated with train travel, and to be considerate of America's military personnel, it won a prize for outstanding advertising. But it was issued by a company that was at that point in bankruptcy and had been for nearly a decade. By the time the reorganization was over in 1947, $37 million worth of the Pennsylvania Railroad's money was gone forever. The value of the stock was wiped out. And that, to a large extent, cured the Pennsylvania Railroad on any kind of direct investment control in the New Haven. Now, the New Haven in the 1950s was still a very weak railroad, but one that was attractive to outside investors. And that's what contributed to the 1954 proxy battle, pitting the fairly new president of the company, Buck Dumaine, who inherited that role from his father, who was also involved in a proxy battle in the 1930s, against an outsider, Patrick McGinnis. If you've heard of Robert R. Young, who was involved in the Chesapeake and Ohio, the New York Central, and of course played a role in instigating the initial Penn Central merger proposals. Patrick McGinnis was in many ways a kind of junior version of Robert R. Young. They were both financiers rather than railroaders. They were both charismatic, flashy, favorites with reporters because they always told good stories, and they promised far more than they can deliver. And certainly Patrick McGinnis said, put me in charge. I'll make the company profitable. There'll be lavish dividends. I'll rehabilitate passenger service, which will make a profit, by the way, thanks to the use of new equipment, and everybody's going to be happy. And he prevailed, at least for a while. And McGinnis took control of the New Haven. He introduced new paint schemes to kind of liven things up a bit. He encouraged things like trailer and flat car or piggyback traffic. And he did support the development, as did Robert Young, by the way, of these innovative new train designs like the Daniel Webster, the John Quincy Adams, the Roger Williams. None of them really worked very well, and advertising campaigns encouraging families to travel on the New Haven didn't work that well either, in part because they ran headlong into efforts at all levels of government to support the construction of fast, paved, all-weather, limited access, high-speed roads, like the Connecticut Turnpike. And here is Connecticut Governor Ribicoff and the State Highway Commissioner in January of 1958, inaugurating construction of a section of the Connecticut Turnpike, and which was ironically built in parts on real estate that New Haven had owned, because there was an effort to build a more inland, more direct, higher speed route, which would have certainly made Amtrak's life much easier today, but it ran afoul of the Great Depression and the New Haven's high debt and limited financial abilities. And so New Haven suffered accordingly. As you'd expect, traffic grew substantially during the World War II years, and then it fell pretty precipitously. And if the situation involving freight traffic was bad, the situation involving intercity passenger and commuter traffic was even worse, and it was a constant drain on the New Haven's finances. So these are systemic problems with highway competition, high terminal costs, short hauls, money-losing passenger and commuter service. But the beginning of the end really came for the New Haven and for other railroads, really, thanks to the so-called Eisenhower recession that began in 1958 and continued into 1959. That's what many people call it. It's a bit unfair. It wasn't Eisenhower's fault, but he was in office when it happened, so he kind of gets blamed for it. In any case, the New Haven suffered probably worse than almost any other railroad from the Eisenhower recession. In 1959, it suffered a whopping $10.8 million loss. And you'll note that more than $12 million was in the form of a passenger service deficit. In other words, if the New Haven had not operated any intercity passenger trains or any commuter trains, it actually would have made money, not a lot of money, but some money in 1959. So on its freight business, the New Haven was just barely profitable. Well, the Eisenhower recession coincides with the first version, and there were two, of the Pennsylvania Railroad New York Central merger proposal, which was announced on November 1st, 1957, and was studied for a while within the two companies, and finally fizzled out in January of 1959, just at about the end of the Eisenhower recession. Now, when the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central announced their intention to merge, it terrified New Haven executives and New Haven investors because the two companies, the PRR and the NYC, together were responsible for 44% of the New Haven's interchange traffic. And one might logically assume that the new Penn Central would use the Boston and Albany to penetrate New England, depriving the New Haven of much of that traffic and resulting in $9.5 million reduction in annual freight revenues, which would be enough to finish off the New Haven once and for all. And with the New Haven in serious financial trouble, George Alpert, who was at that time the president of the New Haven, McGinnis had gone on to bigger and better things, including a stint in federal prison, though not for anything he did at the New Haven. That was a different story. Alpert is now the president of New Haven, and he is sitting in the office of Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and he's holding his hat. But it's a metaphor too. His hat is literally in his hands, as he is basically begging for any kind of state government funding to rescue the New Haven, or at the very least, offset some of the horrific losses from commuter and intercity passenger service. Nice try, but it didn't work. And in fact, the American people were interested in other things besides the fate of the New Haven. If you look at the headline to the left, you see that Americans are concerned about what's going on in Cuba, which will ultimately result in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And to the right, there is the growing momentum toward the construction of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. And so things like these are consuming the attention of politicians and journalists at the local, state, and national level, not the New Haven. And without any meaningful assistance from anybody, the New Haven goes bankrupt again in July of 1961, and journalists begin to interview people who had experience with the New Haven's previous bankruptcy in 1935, and the fact that they lived through two of these events indicates in just how bad the New Haven's financial situation was. The problem is the commuter. All these people who are trying to get to and from work on the New Haven, they don't care that New Haven's losing money on every single commutation ticket it sells. They need to get to work. They need to get home again. And as government officials are increasingly beginning to realize, if the New Haven shuts down and if commuter service ends, then they are going to have to come up with the money necessary to build all sorts of new freeways to handle the commensurate growth of automobile traffic. But the question is how to make that work. And the problems in New Haven collide headlong with a radical transformation in national politics. Um, Eisenhower steps down after 2 terms in office. The 1960 presidential campaign pits the Republican challenger, Richard Nixon, against the young, charismatic Democrat, John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy, of course, wins the election of 1960, but by the lowest popular vote margin in American history. And so he knows that if he's going to be reelected in 1964, he's going to need all the political support he can get. And that is going to be a little difficult because the Kennedy administration is throwing its support behind the growing civil rights movement in the South. And what that is doing is alienating many white Southern Democrats. And so Kennedy realizes that if he's going to lose the support of white Southern Democrats, he's going to have to gain support for the Democratic Party somewhere else. And he looks around and concludes that the best place the Democratic Party can pick up votes is in northeastern cities like Philadelphia, like New York, like Boston. Many of those cities, of course, are served by the now bankrupt New Haven Railroad. And so that is what lands in New Haven on the national political radar screen. At a time when the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, 2 companies that are seeing increasing financial problems of their own, are announcing, guess what? The merger is on again. And on January 12th, 1962, they say, this time it's for real. This time we really want to form Penn Central. Well, to transform those 2 companies into Penn Central, there are going to be a lot of regulatory hurdles. And it's not just what the government says, not even what the federal government says about the Penn Central merger application. There is a lot of disagreement within the federal government about what to do with this, not just a merger, but the largest merger in American history up to that point. It's a big deal. And the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor are both in favor of the merger, particularly after the New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad negotiate very lucrative labor protection for the workers, that is not the company, conditions associated with the merger. So Commerce and Labor say, look, we got to have the merger because it'll prevent the collapse of the railroads in the Northeast, and with it, the collapse of the American industrial economy. The Interstate Commerce Commission, which is supposed to have oversight over mergers, is in complete disarray. They talk it over among themselves, the commissioners do, and they say, look, Congress never gave us the authority to plan a national rail structure, at least not since 1940, when the Transportation Act of 1940 repealed the planning mandate that Congress put in place in 1920. So we don't have the authority to tell the railroads what to do. All we can do is to evaluate each merger application as it comes before us one at a time, even though every merger application obviously affected all the others. And that is a significant issue because it's not just Penn Central, it is also the Norfolk and Western trying to acquire the Nickel Plate and the Wabash, and it is the Baltimore and Ohio and the Chesapeake and Ohio forming a very close alliance, all of which is coming before the ICC. Now, the real kingmaker here is the Department of Justice. And individuals in the Department of Justice look at this situation, they say, you know what, I don't really care about the economic issues. What I care is about the antitrust issues. And it is simply wrong to allow Penn Central to control so much of the nation's transportation network in the Northeast. And therefore, the Justice Department, under the leadership of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who of course is JFK's brother, opposed the Penn Central merger. With the federal government badly divided on the whole merger issue, and with Justice Department firmly against it, it was clear that James Sims, who's the chairman of the board at the Pennsylvania Railroad, is not the right person to guide the merger proposal forward. He's very close to retirement age, and even though he's a skilled operating employee with a lifetime of experience, he is not a politician. And so Sims recruits the guy on the left, Stuart Saunders from the Norfolk and Western. And Saunders is a very different person. He doesn't know a lot about railroad operations. He's a lawyer, but he is also charismatic. He's personable, and he knows how to play politics and has very, very close ties to members of the Kennedy administration and in the years that followed, Lyndon Johnson's administration as well. And all of this comes to a head in August of 1964. And in some respects, it is August of 1964 that sets the fate, not only for the New Haven, but also for Penn Central as well. Because it is on August 22nd that Robert Kennedy announces that he is running for the United States Senate, not from his home state of Massachusetts, but rather a U.S. Senate seat in New York, prompting many journalists and political opponents in New York to call him a carpetbagger, an outsider, someone who doesn't belong here. So Robert Kennedy needs to make himself attractive to voters in New York. He needs to have an issue. It doesn't really matter what issue it is, but he needs to have some issue that will resonate with New York voters. And he looks around and says, I know something that's going to resonate with voters in New York. That's the New Haven, which is bankrupt and on the verge of shutting down its operations. So I can use that to my political advantage. I can take advantage of all of these, not just commuters, right, but voters who want to keep the New Haven rolling. And so as he is about to leave his post as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy does a complete 180 on the antitrust implications of the Penn Central merger. On August 21st, right, this is the day before he publicly announces he's running for the Senate. He's still Attorney General. He won't resign for about another 36 hours. Robert Kennedy calls all the important people associated with the merger into his office, including Al Pearlman at the New York Central and Stuart Saunders at Pennsylvania Railroad. Nobody from the New Haven is involved. They're out of the room. And Robert Kennedy essentially says, look, let's work something out. And he writes a memo that says, in part, if the hearing examiners, that is the two individuals at the Interstate Commerce Commission who are doing the preliminary evaluation of the merger application, if the hearing examiners recommend the decision should be favorable to the merger, and the merger applicants have by that time formulated terms for inclusion of the New Haven in the proposed Penn Central system, it would be my recommendation that the Department of Justice not continue opposition to the merger. And the memo also said that transportation services will continue to be rendered by the New Haven Railroad and that such services will not be impaired by the Penn Central merger. And Robert Kennedy signs this. He gives copies to Saunders, to Perlman, and Saunders and Perlman go out of the room saying, yes, we did it. We got the Department of Justice on our side. Problem solved. And it is on that basis that they proceed full bore with the merger. And I saw before I actually began talking, someone had put in the chat feature, isn't it a shame that the federal government required the Pennsylvania Railroad to cut loose the Norfolk and Western, to sell its Norfolk and Western securities, which of course were the single biggest source of income for the Pennsylvania Railroad from those Norfolk and Western dividends. Well, understand what's going on here. The Norfolk and Western is in the process of merging with the Nickel Plate and the Wabash, creating a pretty robust railroad network in the Midwest. And the Interstate Commerce Commission is understandably concerned that if the Pennsylvania Railroad continues to own so much of the Norfolk and Western, then in effect, the Pennsylvania Railroad plus the New York Central would control not just Penn Central, but also Norfolk and Western, Nickel Plate, and Wabash, and that would be too much of a monopoly. And so one of the conditions of the merger is if the Penn Central merger is going to go forward, then Pennsylvania Railroad has to dispose of its Norfolk and Western securities. It's a risky thing to do because the merger has not yet been approved, right? The sale of the Norfolk and Western stock predates the ICC approval of the merger, but it is based on this memo from Robert Kennedy that Pennsylvania Railroad executives think they're in the clear and they agree to sell the Norfolk and Western. Now, the merger application for Penn Central takes a long time. It is approved by the two Interstate Commerce Commission examiners in March of 1965. And they make it very clear that Penn Central will take on the New Haven, but only its freight service, not its commuter service or intercity passenger service. This is not what Robert Kennedy wanted, right? This doesn't help him politically. And he is putting pressure on everybody he can to do something about the passenger and commuter service. And as a result, there are a series of meetings with Justice Department officials, no longer RFK, he's out of the Justice Department, but his successors. And those Justice Department officials make it very clear that they expect Penn Central to take on everything, freight, passenger, and commuter. And not surprisingly, Walter Grant, who is the New York Central's vice president in charge of finance, said he was horrified at that prospect. Assistant Attorney General William Orrick, who had a meeting with Stuart Saunders at the Pennsylvania Railroad, said Saunders went out of there crying. And I don't think that Saunders actually was in tears, but he probably felt like crying when he realized what an incredible blow this was to the financial health of the Penn Central should it actually be formed. Now, the New Haven's trustees of this bankrupt railroad are trying to sweeten the deal and encourage the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central to voluntarily assume control of the New Haven. So in October of 1965, they issue a petition to discontinue the New Haven's intercity passenger services, all of them. It has no chance of succeeding before the ICC, but it's a very clear signal that the situation is dire and that somebody had better do something if the New Haven is going to survive. 9 days later, the Interstate Commerce Commission begins evaluating the Penn Central merger with that sort of Damocles hanging over the New Haven. And finally, on April 27th, 1966, the ICC approves, the full ICC approves the Penn Central merger. And step by step, they follow the recommendation of the two hearing examiners from the year before, with one major exception. Whereas the hearing examiners said freight service only, the full ICC says everything, freight, passenger, and commuter. Under those terms, we will allow the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central to take on the New Haven and merge into Penn Central. And what is fascinating here is that there was actually another ICC decision announced on the same day. And that was the so-called Northern Lines merger, an attempt to combine the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, and the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy. And at that time, the ICC said no. And if you look at the two proposals, they're almost identical. Parallel lines serving the same area. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that the Northern lines didn't have any stepchild to save, and Penn Central did. Of course, Burlington Northern comes about later, but that's an entirely different story. Now, the ICC, in issuing their approval for the merger, said it should be made clear that Penn Central Transportation Company is not to become the repository for all the ailing railroads in the East. So they said, this far and no farther, right? Only the New Haven, nothing else. And they also said the inclusion of New Haven's passenger service shall in no way be applied or construed to mean that New Haven passenger deficit operations, if undue, must be borne by the savings resulting from this merger, which is bureaucratic doublespeak because they didn't set a dollar figure on this. They're simply saying we are going to cross our fingers and hope that the New Haven's deficits are not going to drag Penn Central down into ruin. The question then became, how much does does Penn Central pay for the New Haven? Walter Grant, the New York Central, said he didn't want the New Haven for $1 or at any price. But he grudgingly conceded that a fair value for the company was $41 million. The trustees of the bankrupt New Haven say, yeah, it's worth 128. The ICC says actually it's more like 239 million. And so it takes month after month after month to sort out what the company's actually worth. And in the meantime, in August of 1967, the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central agree to establish a $25 million loan fund for the New Haven, contingent on the Penn Central merger. In other words, saying unless the Supreme Court, which is where it's going at this point, approves the merger, then until that happens, the New Haven cannot borrow any money from this loan fund. The Justice Department has now completely abandoned its antitrust concerns in its desperation to save the New Haven. It says Supreme Court approval is necessary if, right, if the New Haven is to survive as a railroad. Finally, in January of 1968, the Supreme Court approves the merger, removing the last of many hurdles. February 1st, 1968, Penn Central begins operations, but only with the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central. Penn Central does not yet include the New Haven because the Penn Central is still arguing with the New Haven's trustees about what the company is actually worth and desperately trying to shirk its responsibilities to acquire the company. But with the merger of Penn Central in place, in February of 1968, the New Haven borrows its first 5 million from that $25 million loan fund, another $5 million in August, another $4 million in November. And finally, the ICC is running out of patience. It orders the New Haven to be included in Penn Central by January 1st, 1969, and sets the purchase price at a whopping $145.6 million. And only weeks before the inclusion is to take place, the New Haven makes massive cuts to its intercity passenger services, but of course the deficits continue. And then on December 31st, 1968, lawyers and executives signed literally thousands of pages of conveyance documents to make the New Haven officially a part of the New York Central. And so what is left in New Haven is integrated into Penn Central's operation. And predictably, the results are not good. Again, it was not just the New Haven that brought the Penn Central to its knees. There are many other issues as well, but the Penn Central's problems really had a lot to do with the massive deficits incurred by the New Haven, especially its commuter operations and its intercity passenger operations. And keep in mind that the entire problem stemmed from not the competitive economics of the railroad industry, but from the political transformations that were taking place in the United States, and in particular from an attorney general who wanted to be a senator and ultimately president in his own right. So the Penn Central collapsed, derailed, whatever metaphor you want to use, and the New Haven was to a large degree to blame. So thank you for that. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Dave pointed out that some of you might want to know more about what I'm doing next and where to buy my books. So I'm actually giving a couple of presentations in person, not via Zoom. This on September 18th, which is a Thursday evening. I'll be at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, talking about the Penn Central merger. I've made some references to that in my talk this evening. This will be focused very directly on the whole merger negotiations and everything else. And then on September 27th in Strasbourg, it's a Saturday evening, at the, I guess it's a members banquet for the Friends of the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. I'll be talking about the Pennsylvania Railroad's advertising and marketing initiatives throughout many decades of its history. So if you feel like hopping, I guess the next gen Acela by this point, and riding down to Wilmington, or taking Amtrak to Lancaster and seeing one of these presentations, you might enjoy that. And then if you want to read a lot more, because they are long books, anybody who has them knows that they're fairly thick books. Volume 1 was published by Penn Press and is available from them. Volumes 2 and 3 from Indiana University Press and is available from Indiana University. And of course, Amazon has everything, including, I've been told, copies of my books. So if you want to buy those, you're more than welcome. So I will wrap things up here. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And thank you for your attention.
Anyway, thank you very much. A fascinating program, a lot of intrigue involved in that whole situation. We do have just one question in the chat. Question is, who sued to block the Penn Central merger?
It wasn't, strictly speaking, a lawsuit. It was, well, I'm sorry, that's not true. The Justice Department was involved in making its views known, its opposition to the merger known before the Interstate Commerce Commission. As far as the actual lawsuits were concerned, the genesis of it was the trustees and the bondholders in New Haven filed, and I would even have to go back. It's a very complicated story to look at my own notes and what I've written on that. But filed a lawsuit on that that wound up in Judge Friendly's court in New York, I guess. And that was, and he issued an injunction against the merger, and that's what ultimately proceeded its way up to the United States Supreme Court.
Great. So we do have a question here. If Amtrak and state commuter authorities were created prior to the merger, do you think a freight-only Penn Central could have made a go of it, even with the New Haven?
Yeah, it's an interesting counterfactual question. It's hard to say. Um, in part because it's a chicken and egg question. So, yes, had commuter rail authorities, Amtrak, whatever, been created before the establishment of Penn Central, they certainly would have made things a lot easier for Penn Central. But then it wasn't until Penn Central and other companies began to conclusively demonstrate that they were in serious trouble that the political will emerged to create things like Amtrak and properly funded commuter rail authorities. Um, so I think, yeah, it's had Amtrak been created in, say, 1960 instead of 1971, had commuter rail agencies taken over commuter service in 1960 instead of decades that followed. Um, I think Penn Central might have lasted longer before it entered bankruptcy. It might just possibly have avoided bankruptcy altogether, but there were other really serious problems affecting Penn Central beyond just the passenger and commuter deficits.
Okay. Another actually comment. The irony of New Hampshire, or sorry, New Haven passenger losses was that even toward its ultimate demise, the food and beverage service was profitable sales of alcohol to commuters.
Yeah, well, a lot of those homeward bound commuters doesn't have to be Friday night either, just to kind of unwind after a long day in the office. So, yeah, the alcohol sales helped and everything. Uh, Very different situation from, say, Pennsylvania Railroad passenger trains like the Broadway Limited, which, of course, lost money on their food service and everything. And so that the food and beverage sales helped, but certainly not enough to overcome the operating deficits.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Have you written, whoops, just moved. Have you written about the New Haven integration in your third volume on the Pensy or in another publication?
No, I haven't. As I said, I'm not an expert in the least on the New Haven, except maybe as far as it relates to the Penn Central. I kind of had to stop somewhere. Volume three is 850 pages or something like that. So it's just one of those things I just didn't feel I could work into it. Um, and I see another, I'm looking at the chat and everything. Pennsylvania Red should have just taken over the N&W. Yeah, if you think about it, and what's interesting is, and I'll talk a little bit about this in my presentation at the Hagley. Um, the Department of Commerce, this is before the establishment of Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce evaluated some of these merger proposals. And there were some individuals in the Department of Commerce who looked at the situation and said, Penn Central makes no sense whatsoever. What really should happen is that the financially troubled northeastern railroads should be paired with Pocahontas coal carriers, of which there are two, Chesapeake and Ohio and Norfolk and Western. And logically, that means that the Pennsylvania Railroad should be merged with the Norfolk and Western and adding the nickel plate and the Wabash and so on. And because the New York Central had longstanding ties to Chesapeake and Ohio, it makes sense to combine New York Central with Chesapeake and Ohio and throw in a few other companies, maybe Reading, Jersey Central, and so forth, maybe B&O. And that would be the best way to have a rail system in the East. And if you think about it, after the Conrail split in 1999, as the person has pointed out, that's exactly what happened, right? We essentially have that system today with Norfolk Southern and with CSX. But at the time, um, James Sims and then Stuart Saunders was just absolutely set on a merger with New York Central. And they focused on that to the exclusion really of all the other possibilities, even though federal government officials were warned that that was not really the best way to go.
Okay, well, that looks like that's all the questions that we have, excuse me, up here. So again, I want to thank Albert for a wonderful and very informative program.